What's up, guys? I'm Karastar, and this clip is from Difficult Content, an interview podcast about Final Fantasy XIV. Make sure you hit the subscribe button below and click the link at the end for the full interview. I first became a healer main back in Promise, so Endwalker's been the first expansion that I've healed every prog. You, however, have healer logs dating back to Gordius. In your opinion, what was the biggest change from one expansion to the next when it came to healing? Walk me through a quick healer retrospective from Heavensward to Stormblood to Shadowbringers to Endwalker.
Probably the largest change in terms of healer design was the way that the game paradigm shifted from giving you tons of DPS tools and kind of a fairly limited healing capability without expending GCDs, and then over time they consistently changed it and scaled back on the complexity of damage dealing, and then they added a lot more ways that you could then heal every expansion in every single scenario without using GCDs. So if we use Scholar, for example, which is my favorite job because I think it's a pretty good example actually. In Heavensward, I was a white mage main, but Scholar is probably the best example because Scholar had like 5 dots in Heavensward, I think. You had Shadow Flare that you placed on the ground, you had Miasma, you had Bio, you had Bio 2, you had Arrow that you cross-classed from white mage that you also used for movement, you had a dot AoE, and all of these individual dots had completely different timers that you had to keep track of. And then on top of that, as a healer, in order to DPS, you needed to use Cleric Stance, and whenever you used Cleric Stance, you were completely locked out of healing for 5 seconds straight. So you needed to make an active decision that you could sacrifice the ability to protect the raid for those 5 seconds, right? Back then in Heavensward, it felt like there was a massive risk reward to dealing damage, and you had to make a significant choice as to whether you wanted to do damage or to heal. And over time, I think that has changed quite a lot. I suppose on top of that as well, right, healers also had quite a higher burden of mitigation compared to most of the group, because the majority of the group back in Heavensward didn't really have that much to offer in terms of group mitigation. It was mostly on the healer, and the healer had less tools to deal with any specific raid damage. Say like Scholar, which was the shield healer, right? You had Spread Low and Soil and maybe Illumination, and that was it. If that's not enough, tough luck, buddy, right? I also think that they used to design around heavy raid damages a lot more in Heavensward, whereas now they like to use raid damage plus something. They like to use like raid damage while moving or raid damage while the group is spread, because they know that the players have more tools and the non-healer players have more tools to deal with things themselves. So I think they kind of like to put the players in more interesting scenarios and try to make them deal with that. Whereas in Heavensward, it was a much more what you see is what you get. And a lot of the difficulty was based on dealing with the scenario with the limited tools that you had and also finding a way to deal damage as well. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I also kind of think that fights back then probably didn't expect healers to deal significant damage to beat the Enragers, whereas now they definitely do. I mean, like, you go back and try and do Abyssos while the healers are doing 0 DPS. It's like, good luck with that, right? I think, honestly, Stormblood is probably my favorite expansion on the whole, because it was really a sweet spot between the design philosophy they had then and the design philosophy they had now. Most healers had a couple of dots or something unique that was interesting to think about while dealing damage, but they removed Cleric Stance as a stance and they kind of added it as a pure damage vamp. They also started making healers have a lot more powerful healing tools. They gave them extra off globals like Benison, they gave them Excog, Earthly Star, things like that. From that point onwards, healers have always kind of shifted further and further towards having powerful healing tools and further away from having interesting DPS rotations. I think that's kind of how healers have changed on the whole, and I think fight designs have gotten exponentially more complex as time has gone on, because the jobs have become more simple over time. I think not just healers, but all jobs have become more simple over time, and as a result, they feel that they can use player brain space a bit more, right? Any kind of brain space you were originally using to hit 6 bloody buffs in Heavensward, you now have that space free so you can deal with an extra mechanic, right? I think that's what the devs think and what they expect of players nowadays.
There's been plenty of criticism about the healer role over the years, whether from that perspective of homogenization to the abundance of OGCD tools to the so-called one-button rotations. Do you think the healer roles in Final Fantasy XIV are currently in a bad place? And if so, why do you still primarily play healer?
The short answer is probably kind of. And the long answer is more nuanced than that. I think that more and more over the years, me personally, I begin to think of healers as a prog job specifically, because when you're in a scenario where you're still learning an encounter, you're still figuring out the timings, trying to understand how much mitigation you need, and most importantly, as a healer, trying to learn how many casts you can gain as damage GCDs and how much healing you can reduce. That part of healing is so interesting that I think it makes healer the most interesting job or role in the game in a prog scenario, at least to me. But because the rotations are now so simple and they're basically defunct, right? You press your dot every 30 seconds and then you 1-1-1 and there's nothing more to it. The moment prog is over, it feels like keeping playing them is almost a punishment for all the fun that you got to have in progression over the other people in the group. So I really enjoy the punishing nature of healing prog, so I struggle to think of playing anything else in that environment. I would really like to see healers gain back a little more of their complexity. I think the Stormblood healer design was probably a bit of a sweet spot, and giving each healer just one additional damaging mechanic, which is unique to their job and gives them one more thing to think about, would do a world of good. Because I know a bunch of people personally that used to play healer and they quit because they don't do blind prog and they can just check what other groups are using for mitigation, and then suddenly the fun and interesting part of healing is gone. And when you don't have to think about your mitigation or how to gain casts, you might as well go play summoner, right? Because summoner's more fun than doing that on healer.
It's interesting to hear you talk about healing as a prog job because I couldn't agree more. I spoke with Kareth about this a few weeks ago because when you're first learning a fight, I can't think of a role that's more engaging. But when it comes to reclears or optimization, healer quickly becomes the most boring role.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree 100%. I really enjoy playing healers in prog, and the moment prog is over, I want to play anything else. When I go pug, I don't heal, nothing like that. I want to go play tank, I want to go play DPS, because I feel like there's more to learn in a post-prog scenario on those jobs than there is on a healer.
What job is your favorite to take into Party Finder?
Either Dragoon or Machinist. Machinist feels really good right now. It's quite an easy job to play, I think. It's very much you can pick up and play. You've got free movement. You don't need to worry about uptime. So even if I've never gone in on a DPS before, I feel like I can instantly adapt to the DPS specific mechanics and timings and have an easy time with it. And Dragoon is just fun. I really like the 2-minute window on Dragoon. It's really satisfying to do 6 million weaves in about 15 seconds. So I really like playing Dragoon as well.
Along those lines, which healer job and in which expansion was your all-time favorite? Give me the ideal Rinon healer time capsule.
Scholar is my favorite job, and I think that Stormblood Scholar is the best iteration on Scholar for exactly one reason. There was a skill called Miasma 2, which was an AoE dot. But back in Stormblood, it would also be part of your single target rotation. It was an instant cast, close combat. You had to be in melee range to hit with it. It was a 12-second dot, and it was a DPS gain on single target. And the catch of it was that it had a very high MP cost. I think it even had a higher MP cost than a Sucker. I don't remember exactly right now. What was interesting about this is, other than that, you just had 2 dots to maintain. It's pretty simple, 2 dots and spam broil. But Miasma 2 gave you a risk reward that you don't really see very often anymore, because every time you used it, you had to weigh up whether you can use Miasma 2 for more damage, or whether you need enough mana for a potential res or a sucker or something like that later in the phase. So I really like the fact that as a scholar in Stormblood, you had to manage your mana mid-fight. It wasn't just press Lucid on cooldown and don't think about it further, because it felt really rewarding to figure out how many Miasma 2s you could use in a fight. Stormblood had some of the best raid design fights in the game, right? It had something like God Kefka, which is definitely no slouch in terms of healing requirements. So having to manage and figure out how many Miasma 2s you can get away with during an encounter that has a really high healing requirement was super fun. And I think that FF14 needs more risk rewards on healers to make them have a good time.
Hope you enjoyed that. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button below and click this link right here for the full interview.